Urban fantasy has always been a fun genre to play in, but I've been thinking a lot about other historical periods that can be fun as well. Indiana Jones, stories using steampunk elements such as Atlantis the Lost Empire. I would have included Treasure Planet here, but it's a bit too fantasy to count, even though it is, indeed, steampunk. The TTRPG Call of Cthulhu and Critical Role's recently released Candela Obscura all are based on the idea of magic and mysticism interplaying with historical fiction. So, I decided to come up with a list of all the settings that I think are best for a Scion game. I'm trying to avoid settings that favor one specific pantheon over another, though you should feel free to run a story set in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom or in India pre-colonization, but this list is to give ideas that can incorporate several different pantheons and give your players realistic options for their characters from those different pantheons. This will, to the best of my ability, include ideas for areas outside of the United States, but as an American, many of my ideas and knowledge are pretty American-centric, so I apologize if this has a lot of references to events that mostly affected America and not much about other areas of the world. Historical fiction is tricky because in a lot of ways the past was not a good place for a lot of people. Classism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and sexism was rampant. The world of Scion can be removed from those elements should you so choose, but the issues of the past give your players a way to fight back against these elements in fiction. But you should always ask your players if they want these elements to be present in the game before introducing it. Using a questionnaire to determine your players' limits is always a good thing, regardless of whether you're playing in a historical setting or not. I'll link to a good resource in the description. But now let's get started. The Pirates of the Caribbean films may not be very accurate to what the actual Golden Age of Piracy was like, but it gives a great blueprint as to what a piratical fantasy game might look like. Not only do sea monsters run wild, but the mysterious islands, cursed treasures, and other pirates who have found wondrous dark powers plague the seas to hinder and terrify your heroes. Historical figures like Bonney, Calico Jack, and Blackbeard can be incorporated as Scions on their own quests that intersect and pit the band against other interested parties. You want something a little bit more mundane as your main antagonist? The East India Trading Company, also used in the pirate films, is not a bad place to start, or the Dutch, French, British navies. Going across the sea, Sheng Yi Sao was a powerful pirate captain in the South China Sea, allowing for more of a wuxia feel to your series. The Golden Age of Piracy is going to be your best bet for any sort of fantasy questing and leaning more into mystical elements. Just be careful to not spend too long narrating travel from place to place. It's already difficult to keep players' attention when traveling over land. It can be absolutely abysmal to try and narrate the long, boring, months-long adventures across the sea. The year is 1838. A year into the Victorian Age and 2 years before the end of the Industrial Revolution. In March, a combination of rain and melting snow causes the Danube River to overflow its banks, washing away villages in West Hungary. More than 150 people are drowned. A trail of tears when almost 60,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and moved out west begins in May of this year. By the end, over 7,000 are dead from disease, starvation, or exposure. Queen Victoria is coronated in late June of this year. Of course, you do not have to constrain yourself to just years that overlap between these two periods, but it's easier to talk about them in the same breath when they do share a lot in common. Anything set in the Industrial Revolution or the Victorian Age will deal heavily with colonialism, class, race dynamics, gender, and sexuality. It will also deal with invention and science that has moved too quickly for the safety of the people using it, or in certain cases, capitalism and greed winning out over informing and protecting the public. This is the time of the World's Fair where your children of Shipehotep, Ptah, and Hephaestus can marvel at the creations of mankind, submit their own machinations, and battle with both the mortal and Scion crafters who have gathered to compete for the title of the most brilliant mind. Will Kali's daughter rise up to overthrow British rule in India? Or will she overthrow the caste system that has held her and her father captive for years? Will Athena's blessed, chosen son fight to bring more than just housework, marriage, and motherhood to his patron's beloved women? These things that threaten in this time frame are both mundane and magical, innocuous and daunting. Something as small as a child's toy can bring death to an infant. For more information about specifically the British household's everyday dangers, I recommend Absolute History series on hidden killers. It's a great documentary series on the items in a normal household that can cause serious injury or death to its occupants. Honestly, most people will choose to play in World War II if they choose to do a wartime series, but I would argue that the Great War is a better setting, particularly if you would like to do some sort of spy-centric story. The weapons of mass destruction are just becoming popular for use in warfare, and the various spy networks of nations crisscross each other constantly. It's an excellent setting for intrigue, deception, politics, and a few well-placed poisonings. No one's really the good guy, though there are certainly bad guys. So keep your chin up and tell yourself that this is for your country and soldier on. The Great War has just ended and everyone is celebrating the boom in economics in the United States. Egypt declares its independence in 1922 and Tutankhamun's tomb is opened the year afterwards. Over 100,000 people die in the Great Kanto earthquake in Japan, and in China 200,000 are killed in another earthquake a few years later. In 1928, both the iron lung and penicillin are developed, greatly improving the ability of doctors to save patients' lives. In 1929, the stock market crashes, leading to the Great Depression. The Roaring Twenties is a time of opulence and excess. Europe was in shambles after World War I, at the time just called the Great War, but America was thriving. A ban on liquor was passed in 1920 and wasn't lifted until 1933, but a lucrative business of alcohol smuggling came to take its place. A game set in the Roaring Twenties can focus on the differences between life for those who have versus those who have not. It could also be a game focused on the interplay between the gangs that began to run speakeasies and other illegal establishments that would supply booze to its occupants, or about the catty pettiness of the uber-rich. Any way you slice it, however, the 1920s is a political setting. Even if you're running a gang of rum runners in Chicago with children of Ama no Uzumi, Orisha Oko, and Sun Wukong, they will have to navigate the shifting fealties to Al Capone or the Genna brothers, or starting up their own gang to wrest power from the others hoping to make a name for themselves. This may seem like an odd one, but hear me out. Kenneth O. Morgan writes that the 1970s have gone down as the Dark Ages, Britain's gloomiest period since the Second World War. This is even before heading into the Thatcher era, which was rife with controversy, particularly for her focus on privatization of business and slashing social programs. This was actually the start of punk music, and personally, I find the idea of playing a game about an original punk quite intriguing. A game set in this era with this idea would lean into classism quite heavily. It would also have a lot of interplay between the main characters and governmental authorities, such as the police, and deal with themes such as political unrest and protests. Unlike the United States, the UK does not have completely protected speech, which makes it much riskier to speak your mind in these places. However, there are always those willing to say what needs to be said, and your band of Scions could also be the band with the music to lead the revolution. If you want to learn more about the history of punk music, even through to today, I recommend watching the documentary Punk's Not Dead. It deals more with the history of punk and its evolution, but it will certainly give you the basic themes of what a story set within this culture would look like. The Veil and Cyberpunk Red both have the science fiction aspects that futuristic stories covered, but what about a bit more magic in your science fiction? What about a science fantasy take on cyberpunk themes? The main threads of cyberpunk can still remain, but instead of focusing on high levels of technology, what about high levels of magic? If you ever played Shadowrun, I'm kind of taking a page out of its book, but instead of jetpacks, now imagine wings made of crystal and enchanted with runes that glow neon in the ever-present rain and reflect back off the slick cement streets. Eyes with digital implants or cumbersome visors with HUDs are replaced with glasses purified in wells of knowledge, blessed to identify key information about people and places as you walk. Dystopian futures with mass corporations that are more the government than the actual government abound. The rich get richer and the poor are forgotten. Gangs and police are basically interchangeable. They'll each protect or rob you for enough money. But even in this despair, the gods have a place. The gods of knowledge, such as Anansi, Thoth, and Freya, are powerful and worshipped widely. Gods of war have taken on patron gangs and encourage the shootouts that take place up and down the street. Crafting and enchanting is also a way to make a lot of money, and the followers of Hephaestus are perhaps some of the best when it comes to the new rune limbs, which are this setting's answer to cybernetics. Whichever setting you try, do your research. Expand upon any questions you have while researching to make a unique, magic-infused world touched by the gods. If you ask yourself, what if Margaret Thatcher was actually a leprechaun? And the answer intrigues you, follow it down the rabbit hole. It could affect Thatcher's policies, her actions, the way that Britain is being run, and the attitudes of the other characters in the script. If the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, is actually a place of worship for Y2K-era Scions, how does that affect the culture of Nashville? Have the other pantheons essentially been pushed out of Nashville? How do they feel about it? Are the music gods particularly upset, or do none of them really want to take over patronage of country music anyways? Is Apollo pissed off at having to be responsible for country music consequentially? This is all an exercise for your imagination. So take your time, do your research, and have a fantastic time.